The first light of dawn crept through the curtains of Brené Brown's home in Houston, Texas, painting the walls in soft hues of gold and pink. Brené, a researcher and storyteller with a heart as wide as the Texas sky, sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, her mind racing. She had spent years studying shame, vulnerability, and courage, diving deep into the human experience to uncover what it truly meant to live a wholehearted life. But this morning, as she sipped her coffee and stared at the blank page before her, she felt something she had spent a lifetime trying to understand: imperfection. It was a feeling that had followed her like a shadow, a whisper in the back of her mind that she was never enough, never smart enough, never thin enough, never perfect enough. And yet, it was this very feeling that had led her to a groundbreaking discovery: the gifts hidden within imperfection itself. Years earlier, Brené had been at a conference, surrounded by brilliant minds, when she had felt the weight of her own inadequacy pressing down on her like a physical force. Who am I to be here? She had thought. What if they find out I'm not as smart as they think I am? The fear had been paralyzing, a cold hand gripping her heart. But then, in the midst of her panic, she had heard a voice, her own voice, whispering a question that would change everything: what if you're enough just as you are? That question had set her on a path to uncovering the truth about imperfection, that it wasn't something to be feared or hidden, but something to be embraced. Because within imperfection lay the gifts that could lead to a life of true joy and connection. Brené had always been a high achiever. She had climbed the academic ladder, earned her PhD, and built a career on understanding the things that made people tick. But despite her success, she often felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from falling into the abyss of not enough. She had spent so long trying to be perfect, trying to control every aspect of her life, that she had forgotten how to simply be. And it was this realization that had led her to the first of the gifts: courage. Courage, she had learned, wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing it anyway. It was about letting go of the need to control how others saw her and instead, allowing herself to be seen, really seen, flaws and all. She remembered the first time she had shared her struggles with shame and vulnerability in a public setting. Her hands had shaken, her voice had trembled, but she had done it. And something amazing had happened. The people who mattered didn't love her despite her imperfections. They loved her because of them. Because her imperfections made her real. And that was the first gift, the courage to be imperfect. But courage wasn't just about being vulnerable with others. It was also about being vulnerable with herself. Brené had spent years berating herself for every mistake, every misstep, every moment she fell short of her own impossible standards. She had been her own harshest critic, the voice in her head a relentless drill sergeant, barking orders and pointing out every flaw. But she was learning to treat herself with the same kindness she would offer a dear friend. She was learning to say, I am enough. And that was the second part of the gift, the courage to be kind to herself. The second gift was compassion, and it was a lesson Brené had learned through a moment with her daughter, Ellen. Ellen had come home from school in tears one day, convinced she was stupid because she had made a mistake on a test. Brené had knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and said, "You are not your mistakes. You are so much more than that." And in that moment, she had realized she needed to hear those words too. She had spent so long judging herself that she had forgotten how to extend grace to herself. So she started practicing self-compassion. She started talking to herself like she would talk to Ellen. She started treating herself with the same love and kindness she would offer to anyone else. And slowly, the voice of her inner critic began to fade. It wasn't gone, old habits die hard, but it was quieter. And in its place was a new voice, one that said, "You are doing the best you can. And that is enough." But compassion wasn't just about being kind to herself. It was also about being kind to others. Brené had spent so long judging herself that she had forgotten how to extend that same grace to the people around her. But she was learning. She was learning to see the struggles of others and respond with empathy instead of judgment. She was learning to say, "Me too." And that was the heart of the second gift, the compassion to embrace her own humanity and the humanity of others. The final gift was the most powerful of all, connection. Brené had spent years feeling like she was alone in her struggles. She had thought that if she just worked hard enough, if she just achieved enough, she would finally feel like she belonged. But she was beginning to understand that true belonging doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being real. She remembered a moment when she had shared her story at a conference. She had talked about her struggles with shame, her fears of not being enough, her journey to embrace imperfection. And after she finished, a woman had come up to her, tears in her eyes, and said, "I thought I was the only one." That moment had changed everything for Brené. She had realized that shame loses its power when we share our stories. And in that sharing, we find connection. So she started sharing more. She started writing, speaking, teaching. She started creating spaces where people could come together and say, "Me too." And in those spaces, she found true belonging. She found people who loved her not because she was perfect, but because she was real. And that was the third gift, the connection that comes from embracing imperfection together. But connection wasn't just about sharing her story. It was also about listening to the stories of others. Brené had spent so long trying to be seen that she had forgotten how to truly see others. But she was learning. She was learning to listen with an open heart, to hold space for the struggles of others, to say, "I see you. I hear you. You are not alone." And in that listening, she found a deeper connection than she had ever known. Brené's journey wasn't easy. There were days when she still felt like she wasn't enough. There were days when the voice of her inner critic was louder than the voice of her heart. But she was learning to let go. She was learning to let go of perfection, of self-criticism, of isolation. And in their place, she was embracing courage, compassion, and connection. She started a practice she called the Gifts of Imperfection. Every morning, she would wake up and remind herself of the three gifts: courage, compassion, connection. She would say to herself, "Today, I will be brave. Today, I will be kind. Today, I will be real." And slowly, those words began to sink in. Slowly, she began to live them. But Brené also knew that wholehearted living wasn't just about her. It was about creating a world where everyone could embrace their imperfections, where everyone could live with courage, compassion, and connection. So she started teaching. She wrote books, gave TED Talks, led workshops. She started a movement toward wholehearted living. And the movement grew. People from all walks of life, from all corners of the world, began to embrace the gifts of imperfection. They began to let go of who they thought they should be and embrace who they were. They began to live with courage, compassion, and connection. And in doing so, they began to change the world. One day, Brené received a letter from a woman named Sarah. Sarah had spent her life trying to be perfect wife, perfect mother, perfect friend. But she had always felt like she was falling short. She had read Brené's book, The Gifts of Imperfection, and it had changed her life. She wrote, "For the first time, I feel like I can breathe. For the first time, I feel like I am enough." Brené's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter. This was why she did what she did. This was why she shared her story, her struggles, her imperfections. Because she knew that when we embrace our imperfections, we give others permission to embrace theirs. And in that embrace, we find freedom. Brené thought back to the morning she had sat at her kitchen table, staring at the blank page, feeling like she wasn't enough. She had come so far since then. She had learned to let go. She had learned to live wholeheartedly. And she had learned that imperfection wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be celebrated. Because imperfection was what made her human. And being human was a gift. As Brené sat at her table that morning, she smiled. She had spent her life studying shame, vulnerability, and courage. But the greatest lesson she had learned was this: the gifts of imperfection, courage, compassion, and connection are the keys to a wholehearted life. And she was determined to share that lesson with the world, one story at a time.